Henry Jackman, composer for the Comey Rule. This was written and directed by Billy Ray, who wrote Captain Phillips, and you did the score for that. So was this how you guys linked up?
That's a good question. Funnily enough, not. I hadn't even put two and two together. I don't know how much the listeners to this show know, but when I started Captain Phillips, it was already a finished cut, and it was very much the sort of Paul Greengrass experience, and it had quite a few different writers, and hadn't really put two and two together. And being asked to work on the Comey Rule, obviously it's a lot later, and Billy was just interested in me doing it. And I think it was only on the third or fourth music meeting when, during a detailed conversation about something or other, he mentioned, well, okay, it's a sort of documentary type issue. It sort of reminds me of a Paul Greengrass thing, almost like a piece of writing I did in Captain Phillips. I was like, oh, you did Captain Phillips? You wrote Captain Phillips? And then I said, well, I did the music for it. So no, that certainly wasn't, that was accidentally discovered several meetings in. But yeah, I was delighted to get involved with the show, regardless of, I was aware of Billy Ray, in general. So with his extremely intelligent and probing style of writing and the subject matter, I was really interested to get involved. As icing on the cake that I found out that he'd written Captain Phillips, which is another. Meant to be,
so.
Yeah, quite possibly, but no, he's fantastic. It's interesting talking about him as a writer, because it does make a difference. I've worked with all sorts of different directors, and people come to directing from a number of different ways, but there is a certain magic to a writer director, because you have such command of, well, ought to have such command of the narrative structure. It's a slightly different angle than coming from, I don't know, picture editing or music videos, or it's a thing you can tell fairly quickly in collaborating with a director if they've also written it. There's this sort of fundamental, because obviously directing involves a whole lot that's completely separate from writing. But when you get into a nuts and bolts discussion about, the intention of a scene, you can feel when that director is also the writer.
Mm-hmm. Well, you've scored a lot of action films, Marvel movies. You also did Falcon Winter Soldier this year. And in those projects, there's like a bad guy and a good guy. And in this, I thought it was interesting because, unless you're a Trump supporter, Trump is like the default bad guy, or like at least a disruptor in the story, and Comey is the protagonist, but he's not your typical hero like a Captain America or someone. So he may have had good intentions, but in real life there's a lot of people who don't like him, and the music is kind of, you don't really play up like the evilness of one character or like the heroism of the other, and it's more in like a murky gray area. So how did you settle on that sound?
Well, that's a very good question. You basically hit the nail on the head. It's very difficult to remain completely unbiased, but the idea of the Comey Rule is not to have some political polemic that reinforces on the one side anyone who hates Trump can celebrate that, and everyone who worships Trump can celebrate that, or anything of that nature. And the most important thing about the story, as I was talking to Billy, was really it's a story about a man, i.e. Comey, who has an idealistic love of the institution, i.e. the FBI, and has a sort of romantic ideal about the high and lofty ideals to which that institution should aspire. And just when he gets the post of his life, it happens to coincide with political events that are so difficult and impossible to manage that he ends up in absolutely extraordinary and impossible situations. So it's not really supposed to be Trump bashing or Trump supporting or Comey worshipping, or it's not a political polemic. It's a glimpse into what it would have been like had you been forced into these impossible decisions. And it has an effect on music. I'm really interested that you were talking about Captain America, because my big pitch to Billy, which he didn't need any selling on because he's a very sophisticated writer, is please can we make sure the last thing we want to do is have adversarial archvillain music for Trump. And even worse, we can, having worked on these Captain America films, I'm very familiar with the vernacular of aspirational melodies and lofty thematic writing that is patriotic and has a fantastical element to it. That is absolutely, if we're not careful, you know, if we start having a theme for Comey that's sort of grown out of an Aaron Copland fanfare for the common man vernacular, it's going to be really cheesy. You're going to think we're trying to sell him as Captain America. So without boring your listeners, I deliberately, my pitch to Billy was, let me go and steal a whole load of chords and harmonic vernacular, weirdly enough, from 16th century ecclesiastical church music from composers like Thomas Tallis and Palestrina, because it'll have this, but not written for a choir and organ, you know, use a piano and a string orchestra, but by using music that's influenced from that period, you'll be able to hear a devotional and almost you know, because it's originally ecclesiastical music, you'll hear the devotion and the formality, but it will be stripped of the unnecessary, you know, patriotic jingoistic aspect that would have been a hazardous place to go to, you know, musically. So I had a lot of fun. That the Comey, there's a piece I wrote called "The Love of an Ideal," and the modal harmony in that is quite close to some of the kind of ecclesiastical music I was singing as a chorister, you know, in cathedral choir. But I got it out of that instrumentation and into you know, a more symphonic instrumentation. That seemed to work because you got the devotional and the sort of formality and the institutional aspects without the flag waving musical patriotism. And the same with Trump. I had a few musical experiments with Trump where I tried some slightly spicy atonal harmony, and it was a disaster because it just instantly felt like you know. So the challenge with Trump was how to write disruptive and unsettling music in a diatonic scale, which took me a little while to figure out. But your question is so on point, because it was absolutely about how to retain the sort of narrative neutrality that you might expect type movie, where, you know, like in Captain Phillips, you'd have to be very unobservant to think that movie is telling you that Somali pirates are bad guys, and, you know, the Americans on the ship that gets hijacked are good guys. You know, the storytelling is such that you understand why those guys end up in desperation they're in. And the idea of Comey is that it's just trying to present you with how it all went down without a big narrative sledgehammer telling you who's good and who's bad.
Yeah, and, you know, I think there's like I guess maybe your instinct maybe to make the Trump music bombastic, but also like Brendan Gleeson doesn't play him that way either. It's not like Alec Baldwin on SNL, you know. And then Comey, he doesn't emerge triumphant in any way like a Captain America after like a big battle scene, you know.
No, of course. And it's true. I mean, compared to one of the things I enjoyed about the show, one of the very enjoyable things about doing things like Kong Skull Island and you know, non-grounded, non-psychologically entirely realistic scenes that require hugely operatic and narratively like invasive music. That's what you're encouraged to do. That's what the full 120-piece orchestra's for. Whereas, you know, a show like Comey, nothing would be more inappropriate. It's a very grounded, highly realistic drama. I mean, most of it, if you think about it, is people talking in rooms. That's a slightly unglamorous way of putting it. So it's a very different, it's a much more, right, exactly. So it's a more disciplined, more understated. I mean, the other composers you're going to talk to have way more experience than me, I would imagine, in TV. So so one of the pleasures of it was coming out of the sometimes giant operatic scale of certain kinds of movies and moving into a more understated thematic world and the instrumentation that goes with that. And like you say, I mean, the acting was, you know, so outstanding that, you know, to have been overblown in those Trump. What I often found is some of the best Trump scenes keep the cue out during the Trump scene and then let the cue come in the aftermath. So that the implications of Trump's behavior, like a sort of viral disruptive influence, is then affecting. Often the Trump music would appear in Comey scenes because in fact it is the repercussions of his behavior that are spreading and affecting the behavior of others who are losing their balance. And when you actually hit a prime Trump scene, you actually stay out of the way and just let the scene take care of itself.
Yeah, because it's usually like people are reacting like, what the hell just happened there after like my conversation with him. So
Exactly. I mean,
yes.
it was anyone. One of the things that I often thought was very unobservant on the liberal side of politics was the classic dismissal of Trump as an idiot. I mean, you've only got to see anyone who went into a meeting with Trump unprepared would just walk out completely baffled. They'd lose their footing. You know, intelligent political people who are used to dealing with tricky situations very quickly find themselves all at sea. Now, I'm not saying the man was a giant intellectual. What I'm saying is he was an enormously powerful disruptive force. And if you can't, you know, even someone with the political and professional skill of Comey found himself in you know, almost impossible waters. And, you know, that was quite fun musically because it was my job to come up with a musical DNA that was sort of the spiraling discombobulation of those trying to hold their professionalism and their, you know, the constitutional principles of what they're supposed to be doing. They're trying to hold it together in what is the equivalent of raging seas. And that really became one of the strong themes of the show.
Yeah, well, you definitely did that. Well, Henry, it was great speaking with you. Congratulations, and thank you so much for your time. And we'll see you back here in a little bit.